Welcome to VideoM13B on Theory of Constraints and our last Module 7 video. No Excel this video, but I do recommend you print out the slides so you can refer back to the data as needed. Time is money. Manufacturing cycle time, lead time or throughput time, is the amount of time between the receipt of a customer order and the shipment of that order. And note that the start and finish time of a cycle can be defined in a bunch of different ways. So start time could be defined as the time raw materials are ordered, and finish time is the time production is completed. But manufacturing cycle efficiency is defined as processing time divided by total cycle time. So MCE separates the total cycle time into processing time, inspection time, materials handling time, waiting time, and so on. And so most firms would like to see an MCE that is close to 1. But constraints are activities that slow a product's total cycle time. So theory of constraints focuses on improving speed at the constraint point in order to decrease overall cycle time. And there are five steps that you undertake in theory of constraints. So the first is you got to identify what is the constraint, where is the constraint in the process. Number 2 is then determine the most profitable product mix given the constraint. Number 3 is maximize the flow through the constraint, so get as much out of it as you can. Then number 4 is add capacity to the constraint. So as need be, maybe hire more, get more machines, get faster machines, whatever it might be. And then number 5, redesign the manufacturing process for flexibility and fast cycle times. Okay, so we have a furniture company and it makes end tables and sofas. So it's a 2-product company. Furniture manufacturing involves 5 processes. Okay, so maybe it does, maybe it doesn't, but for this hypothetical example, it does. So there's the cutting of the lumber, and that's done by 2 employees, and they're considered less skilled. There's cutting the fabric, that's done by 1 employee, that is considered a skilled task. There's sanding, that's done by 2 employees, that's considered a less skilled task. There's the staining of the furniture, that's done by 2 employees, that's considered a skilled task. And there's assembly. And that's 1 full-time and part-timers that add up to 175 hours per week. And that's considered a low-skill task. So the employees work 35 hours a week. And let's assume 4 weeks a month, just kind of for simplicity's sake. Okay, so you are ultimately going to need to refer back to some of these details as we work our way through. That's why I suggested you have some printed off slides. Okay, so the first thing is we have established what demand is for the furniture. So we know that at a price of $250 for end tables and at a price of $450 for sofas, the demand in units per month is 400 end tables and 150 sofas. So that's what the market will wish to get, and it's simply a question of can we deliver that many units of both end tables and sofas. So then we map out the process that's followed from start to finish. So first, let's look at the end table process. So first, there's the lumber has to be acquired. That's the direct materials. Then it needs to be cut, and that takes 30 minutes. Then it has to be assembled. That's 45 minutes. Then sanded, 30 minutes. Then stained, 48 minutes. And then you get the finished product. The sofa process is a little bit different. So the lumber's there. We need lumber, but we also need fabric. So the lumber has to be cut. That only takes 12 minutes for a sofa. The fabric also needs to be cut and trimmed. That takes 48 minutes. The lumber for the sofa needs to be sanded. That takes 30 minutes. And then everything's put together and it's stained, right? So the lumber needs to be stained, and then it's assembled, and that takes 19 minutes in order to get to the finished product. So to summarize some of the key information. So I've got 2 products, a table and a sofa. The demand is 400 and 150. The price is 250 and 450. And my materials costs in total for the table is 100. That was all lumber. And for the sofa, it was 250, and that was part lumber and part fabric. So when I think about the activities that I have to undergo on a per unit basis, The table requires half an hour, so 50%, and the sofa 20% of time to cut the lumber. And the amount of available time is, recall I had 2 employees. They work 35 hours a week, 4 weeks a month. So that's 280 hours available for that task. Sanding took a half an hour for both the table and the sofa. Again, I have the same availability. I had 2 employees, 35 hours a week for 4 weeks. Assembly takes 3/4 of an hour for the table, but it takes an hour and a half for the sofa. And so the time that was available for that was 175 hours a week. Recall that I had 1 full-time and a bunch of part-timers. And so that amounts to 175 times 4, or 700 hours available for that task. Staining is 0.8 hour for the table, 0.3 for the sofa. Again, I had 2 employees, 35 times 4, that's 280 hours a month. And then cutting the fabric was not required at all for the table, but that required 0.8 of an hour for the sofa. And the time I had available was 1 individual, 35 hours a week times 4 weeks is 140 hours per month. Okay, so now I have some of this key data and I need to figure out where are my constraints, right? So how do I identify the constraints? Well, on a product by product basis, I determine how much required hours I have and how much available time I have. And then any other time is slack time. So first we start with cut, right? So I calculate that if I have demand for 400 times half an hour, that's 200 hours I need for the table. I need 0.2 hours for the sofa times the output of 150, so I need 30 hours for the sofa. So my required hours for people to cut labor is 230. I have 280 available, so I have slack time in that area of 50 hours. When it comes to sanding, half an hour for the table times 400, that's 200 units. Half an hour for the sofa times 150 units, that's 75 hours. So I have a required time of 275 hours. Again, I had 280 hours available that I calculated on the last slide. So I have slack time of 5 hours, which isn't very much. In the assembly, recall that the table took 3/4 of an hour times 400, that's 300 hours. The sofa took longer, it took an hour and a half for each assembly. But only 150 units, so that's 225, some weird margins there, 225 hours required for the sofa. So my required hours, 525, I have available 700, so I have slack time in that department as well. Now we get to staining, and it requires 0.8 hours for the table times the 400 tables, 320 hours. 0.3 hours for the sofa times 150 sofas is 45. So the required amount of time is 365, but here I see that I only have available 280 hours, which means that I am undersupplied by 85. Okay, now I know what my constraint is. Cutting fabric, not required for the table. For the sofa, 0.8 times 150 is 120. And you can see that the required time is less than the available time, and so I have slack. So since the sofa requires substantially less staining time, and because it has a higher throughput, it is the most profitable product. So here's the prices, here's the material cost, here's the throughput margin, the constraining time, and the throughput per hour. Okay, so the constraining time we identified is, of course, staining. Okay, so to determine the most profitable product mix, since sofas are the most profitable through the staining constraint, we fill the sofa demand first. So this is just like the constrained analysis we went through in the last chapter. Since they were the most profitable, we're going to fill demand first for them. And then with the remaining staining capacity, fill as much of the table demand as possible. So when you think about what we did last time, we just looked at it at the margin level. We said, well, which one creates the most margin? This time we've identified it in terms of which one's going to be the most profitable getting through this constraint. And in this case, the constraint was staining. So first we're going to fulfill all our sofa demand. So we're going to produce 150 sofas. That's going to require 45 hours of staining hours. That only leaves us 235 for the tables. which means that the production of our tables will be limited to 293, not the full 400 that we would like to make. So what we end up with is sofas generating $200 per unit, or $30,000. The tables will generate $150 throughput per unit for $43,950. So we total about $74,000. Okay, so once we've identified we have a constraint, what we just did is to deal very short term with what we need to do. But theory of constraints requires us to think beyond that, right? So the third step would be, okay, let's see if we can figure out a way to speed up the staining operation. Maybe we could simplify it. Maybe we could train the operator to work more efficiently, or maybe there's some other way. In the fourth step, maybe we could find some other way to add employees or add capacity to the constraint. So it might be difficult to find a skilled employee who wanted to work part-time, but recall we had some skilled employees elsewhere that might have had slack. So it's simply a matter of determining whether or not we could take the slack time that was associated with some of the other steps in the process and have those employees redeployed into staining as needed. And in the final step, furniture should consider the possibility of a redesign, right? So is there some way to use a different type of stain that might require less time or less skill? Or is there some other way? Maybe you stain all the lumber before it even goes into assembly and it's quicker. So you might use more stain, but it goes faster. So these are all things that you could now do a relevant cost study to determine whether or not they make sense. Okay, so the last thing we're going to talk about in Module 7 is lifecycle pricing. And we kind of started with this back in the previous video. And now I just want to kind of close the loop a little bit on some of these lifecycle pricing techniques that we often see used. And I've listed the 4 of them here. So let's go through each one in a little bit of detail. So when you think about full manufacturing cost plus markup, well, that's exactly what it is, right? So that's largely what we've seen in a very basic model. So take your manufacturing costs, so your total variable costs plus your fixed costs, determine what markup you need, that sets the price. That's very different than life cycle cost plus markup. So in the life cycle cost, you now include all the costs within the life cycle. So I've put in this model R&D costs and selling costs, but those are just the types of life cycle costs you may need to include. You really have to understand what is your product and what are the types of costs you may incur over time, right? What if part of your cost is you create some sort of hazardous waste and you need to identify in the long run how you're going to deal with that? Like my favorite would be, spent nuclear rods for a nuclear power reactor. So full cost and desired gross margin, that's exactly what it looks like, right? So think of that as a reworking of the after-tax equals pre-tax times 1 minus the tax rate. So think of it as the price would be the cost divided by 1 minus the gross margin percentage, and that gives you the price that you would need to get to. And then full cost plus desired return on assets is a little different way of looking at it. So imagine that you could kind of measure the cost of a particular asset you needed to put in place. And you said, well, look, I have to have a target return on assets of, let's say, 13%, right? So that means that if the asset employed to make the product costs 10 million, then I need the profit to be 1.3 million, which means that I better mark it up so that I'm going to generate 1.3 million worth of profit. Well, since I lectured you on the importance of these concepts at the end of the last video, I won't go there again. To be honest, I don't even like baseball that much. So I'm going to leave you with this.
Not that any of us should be surprised, though, Stu.
LAFC have just been Zlatan. Welcome to Major League Soccer. Take a bow. Sensational. Did you think he was going to live up to the billing? Of course he did. Out of this world. Every superlative you want. What a way to announce yourself to Major League Soccer. Amazing.
A world-class goal from a world-class player. watch as Boateng open on the near side, instead looking for Ibrahimovic. He knew he was offside, he left it alone. Cole picks it up. Cole's